Let's talk about books. This is Book Talk. I'm your host, Anthony Moirore. At Book Talk, we get to have authors come and tell us about their books, about their journey in writing. And we've always had some great books to discuss and some great authors to come and tell us about them. Today, we have a book, a great book. It's known as Two Floors Above Grief, a memoir of two families in the unique place we called home. It's written by Kevin M. O'Connor, and he's here with us. Yes, I said Kevin is here with us. He's joining us in the studio shortly. Before he joins us, I would like to remind you to please share with all your friends. If you have a question, please ask. If you have a comment to make, we love feedback. So please send your comment to us. And now, without taking one more minute, I'll ask you to join me as we go together to meet Kevin. Here we go. Hello, Kevin.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good to see you. Welcome to Book Talk.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's such an honor to have you here to talk about your book. Now,
I appreciate the invitation. Thanks for taking this time. Much
yeah,
appreciated.
where in the world are you?
Where in the world? Where in the world? I am in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Uh
That's where I've been living since 2000. I've been living in this area since 2007. So I'm in Fort Lauderdale,
huh.
and excited to talk to you there in Athens, Greece. I enjoyed our conversation before the broadcast started and getting acquainted. So, but I'm located right now and have been for the last few years in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Wow, wow, that's wonderful. How is the weather like right now? I'm always curious to know what the rest of the world is doing.
Okay, I'm looking through my window east to the ocean. Um, it's about in the 90s, probably 90s, pretty humid here.
Mhm.
I've already had my walk this morning, and I temper myself when I walk as I walk with my husband Leon, and we walk with the dog. So we walk and get our exercise and come back. So now I'm back in air conditioning for a while. So
Hmm. Oh, interesting. So, is that now you moved there in 2007? From where did you move there?
okay, I moved here from the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and I lived in Elgin, Crystal Lake, Cary. Those are all towns that are in the McHenry and Kane counties in Illinois. Again, this northwest of Chicago. Most of the book, Two Floors Above Grief, is set in those areas, in those northwest suburbs, especially Elgin, Illinois. That's where the book is set. Most of the settings are there, although we traveled around the world in the book to other locations. Most of the book, in Two Floors Above the Grief, is set and based in the house in which I grew up in Elgin, Illinois. So
Yeah,
that's where it's at.
is that book that I saw, Two Floors Above Grief?
Hmm.
I thought is interesting to know. I am always hosting people who have a story to tell of where they came from, the life that they've lived, and maybe get a lesson or two from them.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we're gonna know much more of what is in there. But before we go there, I would like to know when did you actually get started on writing?
Okay, good question, Anthony. Thanks for the question. I actually, when people ask me how long you've been writing this book, sometimes I say 73 years because I was born in 1950, and when I was born, my family was living and in that house that is pictured on the cover. And so the stories that I reveal in the book um, have to do with my life as the son and nephew of an undertaker. When I actually started writing the book, though, was in 2020. So
Mhm.
2020 is when I actually sat down and disciplined myself to put the stories on paper and to put the stories into the word processor and to get it going. And so I collected my thoughts and my stories and took was actually part of a group at nonfiction book school, which helped me organize my thoughts and gave me a process to follow to put those thoughts onto paper. So I started in actually writing the book in 2020, May of 2020, and started yeah, May of 20 or May of 20. I get my years mixed up. The pandemic throws me off. I actually started writing in May of 2021, and through the class I took, and then they helped guide me to get it all into the writing process, and then it went to editing, and then I've self-published the book. It was released in late November of 20, what are we at, 2022. So it's been published now about 6, 7 months. So 7 months as of yesterday, as a matter of fact. So it's been published. So that's when I started. And I'm very happy with the book itself and excited to take it to different people and get it out there in the world. And I thank you and your listeners for help me finding another audience for the book, and anxious to share further with you and your audience about the book.
It's interesting how many interesting things happened during the pandemic. And you tell us that's when you got started writing on your book. What actually triggered you to get in, get it done, getting this story out there to other
Sure.
people?
Okay. Well, the inspiration and the triggers were based on written letters and correspondence that had transpired between my family and I from the late 60s through the mid 70s, early 80s. And I had, through the years, those letters were saved not only by my parents and my aunt and uncle and my cousins, myself, but all those saved letters kept coming back to me. People would say, Kevin, you take the letters, you take the letters. So as I moved about from place to place through my career, and I accumulated it's over 700 pages of letters, handwritten letters and handwritten notes. So I developed a way to organize those letters. And as I put them in plastic sleeves and put them in notebooks and reread them, it gave me a sense that there are stories here.
Mm,
And so that was the inspiration. And I'd been traveling with these letters for years, and finding them in boxes. And I would put them into storage areas and basements and closets and attics as I moved from place to place. And I thought, th- there's stories here that just aren't for me, and they're for other people.
mhm,
And so, as I worked in the writing process and started to conceive of who my audience was, I knew one audience was the family that has come from this house, from 2 floors above grief. It's there's now about 150 to 200 offspring that have come from those families. But then, as I wrote the book, I knew that a lot of families could relate to the stories I was telling, not just people who happened to live above a funeral home, but lots of families who come and are progeny of the businesses and the occupations and the avocations that their parents had had. There's a lot of families that I know who were very much a part of their parents' businesses. So the audience is also those families, and the audience is also those people that created families amidst whatever occupation their parents were endeavoring to succeed in. And so that's you're back to your question. I think was back what inspired me to keep going. Well, was as these stories evolved from the letters, I thought these stories have application not only to my family, but many other families and communities. So that's what kept me going and kept me motivated to keep writing and to keep editing and keep getting the book to a published state.
Yeah,
So
I could be curious to know about the stories that why in that house, the things that you experienced, and those families experienced during that time that they stayed there or they continue to stay. I don't know whether it's still existing. But even before we go to a few of the stories which you could tell us, can I ask you why bring back these stories? Why, if they lived it, why?
why bring him back? Sure, good question, Anthony. And one of the things that I thought provided a richness to the stories was the idea that these were handwritten, typed letters from the 1970s.
Mm,
Um, People don't communicate in that way anymore.
yeah.
People don't, and I thought another underlying theme of the book was the way we communicated. Sometimes I was a student in Rome during part of those years, and sometimes I would get letters in my mailbox written by different family members that were telling the same story. They didn't know they each were writing a letter on the same day sometimes and mailing it to me. But as I would get the letters in my mailbox at school at Loyola University in Rome, I would open these letters and say, wow, they're telling the same story, but they're telling it from their perspective.
Mm-hmm,
And as I reread these letters when I was doing my own research and getting these letters together, I thought about how communication was in the 70s. That was our, I have to believe that this was the way that many families communicated.
mm-hmm,
They, and like in our family, or when I was in my university in Rome or at my university in Chicago, I would look forward to the letters I was going to get in the mailbox.
mm-hmm.
Um, we don't have that same type of thing anymore. Everything, most all our communication now is via text or email.
Yeah.
Some of the things that come across as I'm doing book club talks or making presentations similar to yours, our listeners are saying, I've got all these letters. What am I going to do with them? I'd like to dig into them a little bit more. The other thing that comes across in my conversations with people is, I read the emails, I read the text, but I don't save them. They're probably in our computers someplace,
Mm-hmm,
but a lot of us don't make a file to keep those email communications in.
mm-hmm,
Whereas the communications from the past, people did save some of those letters, those notes, those cards, those greeting cards, letters, aerograms, um, things written on little pieces of stationery that were mailed, thank you notes, things that were mailed and those would come to our mailboxes.
mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole concept of a mailbox is different now. The whole
Yeah.
concept of a mailbox is what we get in our email, what
Mm-hmm,
we get in our text messages.
mm-hmm,
It's not what is handwritten. So I think part of the beauty, what I ended up seeing as the book evolved, was the characters that were I was seeing, people that I knew, people that nurtured me and helped me grow up, but the stories that they tell in their own handwriting and their own typing um, reveal characters that
mm-hmm.
that I don't get a sense of when I read emails. As much as I enjoy getting emails and sending emails, there's a different perception in the written word, in the writing that's done in letters, and I think this answers your question.
Yeah.
But some of the things that kept driving me to put this in, I didn't want these letters to stay in notebooks. They're still in notebooks in the closet on the shelf
Okay.
behind me. They're still there, but I wanted to take parts of those letters, parts of those 700 pages, and infuse them in the book, so
Mm-hmm,
that the people that have come after me have a story about their own family,
mm-hmm.
and families that read the book have not only stories that they can connect with, for their own families, but I think it's provided incentive to readers to say, I want to find the letters that my family have. I know I've got those letters someplace. I want to try to make sense of my own family history through the letters that were written during those times. And we just don't have that same kind of thing happening, I think, with what's going on currently with emails and the kind of communication we do now.
Please share with us one or two stories that come from those letters. So one of the stories or two.
Okay, great, great. Well, I'll tell a story that relates. Well, today's my parents' anniversary, so they were married in 1939. So some of
Mm,
the stories I tell, I've got two stories that relate not only to their anniversary, but that relate to you and I. Um, one of the so today I plan to get out some communications via Instagram, via Facebook, using current communication about my parents' anniversary and how it connects to the book. And so in the book, I talk about their wedding day, and I talk about some of the things the letters they wrote, and one of the things that one of the things my family, and I call that chapter "Dancing Through Life," because my parents, when they got married in 1939, my mom tells stories about her wedding and tells stories about when they had their reception in 1939, how they went back to went back to my grandparents' house for their wedding reception, and how she noticed that one of the cups that people were being served tea in had a chip in it, and so she had to go and take that cup away because she didn't want her mother to be embarrassed by a chipped coffee cup. Um, the other thing I have in the book is a story that my mom, a letter that my mom wrote on the night of her honeymoon when they went up to the town of Milwaukee to a place called
mhm.
the Shorecrest Motel. And so she said, "Dearest mother and father, we got away so quick that I didn't get a chance to give you all half as big a kiss as I wanted to. I miss you already. I am just a little blue at the moment. Blue meaning, unhappy or down a little bit, even though on the night of her wedding. We have a beautiful room right on the lake. I can hear the water and the foghorns as I am writing this. I just took a shower and I feel a whole lot better. My whole body ached when we got up here. My dress is up at Lou Adams' house. She might bring it over. Otherwise, we will go over and get it when we get back. Ah, my hat won't stay on unless I put the band under the chin, which I don't like very well, but maybe I can fix it if I get some thread someplace. Give my nieces a big kiss for me. I'm going to bed now to rest my weary bones. Thanks again, Mother and Dad, for a grand wedding and a reception, and all my love to all of you. Signed, Marion. P.S. Me too. Thanks a million for everything, mostly for your daughter and your sister. We're both very happy about everything. Remember me, I'm the new guy in the family. Signed, Bill. So what that conveyed to me is my mom in her own writing, how fresh her new life was. She had lived with her parents up till that point in her life. Now she was starting this life with my dad. So that's a
Mm,
story that I convey in the chapter that I talk about my mom and dad, where I also talk about how they kept a ledger in their first year of marriage and how they started a business that didn't fare too well, and the decisions they had to make in that first year. And similar decisions that a lot of young married couples do in their first year of marriage, how they take that leap, I guess. They start a new aspect of their life. So that's one story. The other story that connects with you is I'll hold it up to the camera. This is a wood. I gotta get a wood carving that was I bought at a market in Nairobi, Kenya,
mm,
in December of 1970, and
mm,
I mailed this home to my family back in Elgin, Illinois, and my aunt, I sent a box of carvings like this and other artifacts that I got on my trip. And my aunt, Mildred, who's a key character in the book, she had thought that this wood carving was intended for her, when in fact it was intended for my mother. So I write I write in the book about
Mhm.
her confusion, and I'm looking. Well, I'll find. And her letter was how she felt that, and I've got her exact words, which as an author I should be able to go right through to those words. I'm trying to find the page in the book, but the she wrote to me and said that she was giving up this carving to my mom up, who all they all lived in the same house, but she
Mhm.
realized that it was really intended for my mom. So that's another story that I unpack in the book. And now that carving, I've just held it in my hand, and I have it now. So I purchased that 53 years ago,
Mhm.
but it became a fixture in my family's home over the years. And I talk about it talk about the relationship that my aunt and my mom had, and the book also unpacks stories about the relationships between my dad and his brother. They were the owners of the funeral home, and
Mhm.
the book also unpacks stories through their own letters about the relationships that they had, and the hand that they had, the hand that they had with each other, the voices they shared. So that's part of what Two Floors Above the Grief tells about. Two Floors Above the Grief tells the stories of two families that are operating and maintaining a business while also raising six children in two
Mhm.
apartments above the funeral home. So, but I think the stories that I'm conveying in those times are stories that relate to lots of families, families
Mhm.
of cousins and families of brothers and families of sisters, and how we get along and how sometimes we don't get along. But
Mhm.
that's and in the midst of all these family gatherings and the family occurrences are the families in the funeral home on the first floor that are grieving and are allowing my father and my uncle to help them through their periods of grief. So that's really part of what the story is about and what it is to be an undertaking family, the kind of servitude that goes along with helping families cope with situations that are probably for many families some of the worst times of their life. But what my uncle and my father did to help them through those times and through their periods of grief.
Mhm.
So I think I went on a little bit, probably longer than you thought I was going to when you asked that question, but
That's
that, that's part of what the stories are about.
Yeah, and in the letters that you share, the stories that are there, or maybe even outside the letters, are there some details that have found themselves in the book from the operations of the funeral home? Like this happens, this in the were there some stories that or some letters sent from the funeral home or to the funeral home concerning the business and the nitty gritty matters of it?
Sure. Well, nitty gritty, probably not, because I think part of what my one thing I've learned to respect about my father and my uncle is there were nitty gritty stories in terms of families and things that had happened to the deceased and how they operated there. But dad and mom were very and dad and Uncle Lawrence, my uncle, kept a lot of that to themselves.
Hmm.
When they would share their stories about work, they didn't often get into the, like as you used, the nitty gritty of the stories of their clients because that was personal to the
Okay.
families. They
Hmm.
respected the families and whatever the families were experiencing. They kept that to themselves, I think, in a lot of ways, and I didn't really realize that until later. Since I've written the book, I have gotten involved with other stories and podcasts from people that are practicing undertakers, practicing funeral directors, and they and their stories get into some of the nitty gritty. Um, but they, mom and dad didn't share that, but I will talk about one story here. One of the
Hmm.
stories in the book I call Death of a Young Friend. Um, and I talk about the death of a classmate that died. And I said, I start the chapter by saying, I was aware of the concept of grief early in life, and I was often reminded of the inevitableness of death. The phrase, we're busy, meant someone had died. Even closer to my sphere was the death of my elementary school friend Francis in August 1964, prior to the start of my high school freshman year. One day I walked into the office and found Dad sitting at his desk. He hung up the phone and motioned for me to take the seat across from him. Ah, that call was about Francis, he said. He died 3 hours ago. He was running in a field near his house and stepped on a live electric wire that was cut during the storm last night. It was on the ground hidden within the grass. He stepped on the wire and he died instantly. I sat still. It was my first personal experience with the mental and physical state of shock. I had similar feelings when John F. Kennedy died a few months earlier, but this was different. Francis was a friend I had played with recently. With a pit in my stomach and a tear running down my cheek and a lump in my throat, my voice cracked. Well, what happens now, Dad? Well, I'm waiting to hear from his mom, so I will know what time she and her family can come in and talk to me about the wake and the funeral. Where's Francis now? I asked. Well, his body is in the morgue at the hospital. I'm going to call the hospital to find out when I can go pick up his body. Hey, I want to call my friends, I said. Well, I know you do, but I want you to wait until I know a little more. There may be an article in the newspaper this afternoon. Check for that article when you get the papers delivered for your paper route. So I just then the rest of the chapter just talks about the proceedings. But even that reminds me of how my dad kept his work separate from family. He wanted me to show respect for my friend Francis, but also show respect for Francis's family. And he chose not to tell me a lot of the nitty gritty, like you talked about, or the details, because that would
Mm,
cut into the respect that he wanted to share with the family. He didn't want me as a 14-year-old getting on the phone to tell immediately what was going on. And he didn't want me to know some of those things because he wanted to keep me in a perspective of the perspective of being a 14-year-old dealing with death, as well as to keep the respect he wanted to know. He certainly didn't want Francis's family to know that I knew a whole lot about the situation or the condition of Francis's body
mm,
or anything like that. So that was another story that was conveyed, and kind of the separation we had in the family between what was going on in the funeral home itself and what was happening with myself and my brothers and my cousins. So that's just another aspect of two floors above the grief and how we kept those situations separate.
mm. In running a funeral home, and everybody's common knowledge that in a funeral home, it's every single day that you're going to hear about a bad story, the death of a loved one. And my curiosity here is because I have not interacted with people who run funeral homes before.
Hmm.
Are there laughter days? If every day I'm handling some negative news and someone has died here, there, do you still and did you family still afford a smile, a laugh? And are there some incidences in the book touching on this?
Sure. Yes, and I think part of what I may find a chapter here. Part of what the way our family dealt with it is we lived. Yes, we had my father and my uncle um, certainly um, took care of the families that were involved, but and they had us help with that as kids. They they I'm looking for a particular chapter. So how did part of oh here we go. Part of what our family did, we had to have our we kept our own celebrations going as families, even though there might have been things going on. Um, okay, this is a part of the book called "Joy of Family, Friends, and Community." So our families were affected by the sadness and grief of the clients, Lawrence and Dad, and in turn, my Aunt Mildred and my mom, related to the families at a personal level. Our families respected the situations and life changing experiences of their clients. In creating our own lives as families, it was detrimental for us to submerge ourselves into the difficulties and challenges experienced by those temporarily using the spaces on the first floor. I perceive that Dad and Lawrence experienced their best times as brothers when they were celebrating events with our two families, our extended families, or involved together as they were in parish activities. The functions of the business did not allow for many experiences involving just the two couples. As couples and individuals, Mom and Dad participated in social activities separate from Lawrence and Mildred. Dad and Lawrence rarely participated together socially because they always needed to be paying attention to the funeral home. Mom and Mildred got along especially well, but did not shop, play cards, or do activities typical of friends. So then I go on to a chapter called Celebrations, because that partly addresses some of your question, I think. What did we do as families to keep ourselves grounded or separate from the grief that was going on among the families who were our clients? We celebrated small and big gatherings of friends and family in both apartments, even though it was risky to plan these activities due to the unpredictability of the business. The families, our families, ever ready for the possibility of a wake or funeral downstairs, sometimes had to alter plans at the last moment. It was easier to plan bigger parties on Saturday afternoon or evening when wakes seldom occurred. When a graduation event was scheduled on a weekday, the party for the family and friends occurred on a Saturday or Sunday. So I tell stories about um, I tell stories about how the family would get together, and some of the times those would connect to letters. Here's a letter that was written by my dad on September 10th, 1977. Um, Last Saturday, we put an 18-pound ham in the oven and we went to play golf with our cronies at Burr Hill Golf Course. We all came back to the barn. The barn was a place on our property where we would have social gatherings. There were 22 people here. It was a party to end all parties. Somewhere along the way, we may have lost control. We were playing old Mitch Miller records, singing along. Everybody danced. I really think we may have drank too much, but we all had a ball. So one of the things I think about when I hear letters like that from my dad and my mom and my aunt and uncle about what they did socially, separate from the funeral home, is I'm confronted with thoughts of what do funeral directors do with their grief? What does a person who immerses themselves in the grief of others do to keep themselves going? And I've had discussions since the book was published with funeral directors, funeral director associations, people that run funeral director schools, and they talk about the importance of um, what is a what do undertakers do? How do they escape in a good way from the grief that they do um, that they handle for other families. And so part of the book represents that, and not in a way to um, mm, how should I say this? Um, our family needed to get away from the grief that they dealt with readily with other families, and
Mm,
that they needed to balance their life with they were so giving of helping a family get through their grief. What did they do with the experiences they had with those families? They had to sort of get away from that a little bit. So my dad would do it through music. My dad was an instrumentalist. He played the piano. He would seek out places to go. My uncle Lawrence would take 2 or 3 day trips away from Elgin to get himself away, just to take because they needed that. They needed to re-energize themselves to cope with the inevitability of death for other people. So I think that was part of that's part of what I convey in the book. Part of the stories I tell too, to say not only what's happening with the families that are their clients, but what are our families doing to live a life that is normal as possible, even though grief is such a part of the occupation. Grief is part of what the people do, uh,
Mm.
of what undertakers do. So,
Wow, that's quite an experience, quite some stories that you have there. And we are asking the person who's listening or watching to catch up with you and go and read the book, get the book, or get even to know Kevin a bit more. And how do they do that?
and what? How do they do that? Thanks for
How
the
do they
question,
connect with
Anthony.
you? How do they connect
Couple
with you?
ways. I think you've posted my website, or it's KevinO'ConnorAuthor.com. Kevin
Mm-hmm.
O'Connor. There you go. You got it right on the screen. Author.com. That will provide an introduction and also links, ways to purchase the book, which is most readily done through Amazon, using the title Two Floors Above Grief. You can get access to the book that way to purchase it. When they go to my website, there's a way to, at the end, to sign up to link to a newsletter that I published. I publish a newsletter about once a week to talk about the events surrounding the book and the book tours that I'm on. Today I will be next week I'll be posting on the newsletter just some stories about mom and dad and their first year of marriage that will connect more stories of the book. Um, the other thing I'll be doing today is posting on social media. I can be reached through Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and oftentimes on those social media outlets, I've been posting stories that relate to the book, that relate to stories that have come from the, the, the book tours I'm doing. I have a section on my newsletter that's talked about where on earth is Two Floors Above Grief, and I take those stories, um, and take the friends of mine and associates take the book to other places in the world, and then they take photographs of where the book has been going. So the book is traveling around, and so that's another way people can connect with the book. Okay. Hi, Anthony. Uh, right now, I'm not hearing you, Anthony. Not yet.
Can you hear me?
Hmm.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear it. Now your
Okay.
voice is back, Anthony.
Yeah,
Your
we
voice is
had a
back.
challenge there. So, yeah, I was saying we are just about to sign off, but maybe you could leave us with a few words that we could always remember. Which are they?
Sure. Thank you. Well, one of the ways when I do signings for the book,
Mm-hmm.
and I use the very last word in the book is that I write is there is no end to this book. Continue. Let
Mm-hmm.
your stories flourish and be shared. So my call to action as a person finishes reading the book is to say, my book doesn't end because each of the readers has their own story to tell. So I encourage my readers to let your stories flourish and be shared. So I leave you with that you and I have connected in ways of between our stories about Greece that we shared, our stories about Kenya, and some of the stories I shared with our broadcast today, that we all have stories that connect us. And I encourage my readers and the readers of my book to let their stories flourish and be shared. Now, whether they share their stories through a book like I have done, or share their stories through conversations in their own family, or they share the stories through TikTok or through Instagram or through Facebook, the things we do currently, I encourage families to share their own stories and to continue to share through their own connections through social media platforms or through places like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. My book shares the stories through the letters that were written in the 70s, but I want my readers to connect their themselves with their stories and their families through all the resources and tools that we have nowadays that we didn't have in the 1970s. There's a richness out there of stories that can be connected. So that's whether you go to my website, whether you connect if you're family and connect with me with ancestry.com, or whether we do things through other social media platforms like this or podcast. Please let your stories flourish and be shared.
Oh, thank you very much for everything, and thank you for coming to Book Talk. We appreciate your presence.
I appreciate, Anthony, everything you're doing for readers and everything you're doing to help people stay connected.
Yeah, and also thank you to everyone who's watched this interview or listened to it. And we remind you to go and get the book Two Floors Above Grief by Kevin M. O'Connor.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been Book Talk, and I've been your host, Anthony Moirori. And together with our guest today, Kevin O'Connor, we're saying bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.